Among all those who served Sauron during the Third Age, none were as exotic or fierce as the Haradrim, Corsairs, and Black Numenorans, collectively known as the Southrons. Inhabiting the Sunlands, where the stars appear strange, the fierce tribes and kingdoms of Harad developed a remarkably powerful and diverse military and naval force. Their ultimate symbol of strength was the war tower-rigged Mumakil. Tragically, the Southrons were victims of the tyranny of both Numenor and Sauron, and were manipulated into waging war against the West. Despite this, they remained the last peoples to stand in defiance of the West until the Fourth Age. During the Great Sundering of Men, many different tribes migrated west, while yet others travelled south into Harad, a land where the sun beat fiercely upon the earth. After the fall of Morgoth, the Haradrim of the titular land of Harad became an independent people, isolated from the rest of Middle-earth. However, during the Second Age, the Haradrim found themselves caught between the tyrannies of both Numenor and Sauron. At first, the Numenorians, who came to colonize the south, were benevolent to the Haradrim, teaching them agriculture and craftsmanship, as well as constructing the great port city of Umbar. However, after the reign of Tar-Kiatan, the Numenorians began demanding tribute from Haradrim. Later still, the Numenorians began enslaving them, and ultimately took them for human sacrifice. Likewise, Sauron initially taught the Haradrim the arts of stonecraft and metallurgy, enabling them to construct numerous towns and walls. However, Sauron manipulated the Southerners' hatred for the Numenorians to pull them into a war against his enemies. Around SA 1600, the Valar dispatched two blue wizards to Middle-earth, Marinatar and Romistamo, to circumvent Sauron by stirring up rebellion amongst the eastern and southern tribes. They ultimately proved successful in their mission, as Sauron never managed to amass large enough forces in these regions to overwhelm western Middle-earth. The Numenorian colonists of Harad, who survived the fall of Numenor, chose to serve Sauron. Henceforth, they became known as Black Numenorians. Initially, two great rulers rose among them, Perimor and Fuinor, who helped gather support from the Haradrim to wage war against Gondor. Over time, the Black Numenorians would intermarry with the Haradrim, becoming increasingly indistinguishable from the people they ruled. Although their bloodlines were diminishing, the Black Numenorians continued to intermarry with the lines of their enemies, the Faithful. This was exemplified in the marriage between Queen Beruthiel and King Taranon Falastir. This marriage was most likely performed in an attempt by Gondor to dominate the region of Umbar. In TA 1015, the Black Numenorians and Haradrim attempted to recapture Umbar from Gondor for over 35 years, but were decisively defeated by Kirjaher in TA 1050. The kings of Harad were forced to pay homage to Gondor, and many of their sons became hostages to the Gondorian king's court. After the death of King Castamir of Gondor stirred up a succession crisis, turning it into a refuge for enemies of the kingdom, the exiled Gondorian princes allied themselves with the Haradrim and Black Numenorians, forming a union known as the Corsairs of Umbar. They established a pirate society and waged a prolonged, predominantly naval war against Gondor. In TA 1540, the Corsairs earned their first victory by killing the Gondorian king Aldemir in battle. Eventually, the great-grandsons of Castamir, Angamaiti and Sangihiando, became powerful leaders amongst the Corsairs. In TA 1634, Angamaiti and Sangihiando heard that King Minadil was in Pelegir and led a raid up the Anduin. The pirate princes ravaged the coast and Pelegir, killing the king and escaping with great booty. During the time of the Great Plague, the Corsairs raided the Gondorian coasts up to Anflas. However, this brought the wrath of King Tulumitar upon Umbar. In TA 1810, Tulumitar reconquered Umbar, drove out the Corsairs, and killed the direct descendants of Castamir. In retaliation, the Corsairs and Haradrim joined the Wainriders and Variegs of Khand to wage war on Gondor in TA 1851. The Haradrim were able to recapture Umbar and cross the river Poros to invade South Ithilien, but were defeated by Gondor's southern army. The Corsairs would remain a constant pest for Gondor. During the reign of Steward Kirian, they assailed the coasts, and in TA 2746 became involved in a conflict, killing the 15th Prince of Dol Amroth. Afterwards, they spent years building 3 great fleets. During the long winter of TA 2758, the Corsairs and Haradrim again went to war. The Corsairs performed an amphibious invasion of the coasts of Gondor, and at the mouths of the rivers Isen and Lefnui. Concurrently, they gave aid to Wulf, who was leading the Dunlendings against Helm Hammerhand of Rohan. However, Steward Beregond launched his own fleet, gradually driving the Corsairs back to Umbar. Meanwhile, the Haradrim invaded and occupied southern Gondor, waging a long war along the river Poros. In TA 2885, the Haradrim attempted an invasion of Ithilien, but were defeated by a combined force of Gondorians and Rohirrim at the crossing of Poros. In retaliation, a certain Aragorn led a small fleet to perform a night raid against Umbar. During the raid, they burned and destroyed countless ships, and Aragorn killed the captain of the haven before making an escape, suffering minimal casualties. In TA 3018, the Haradrim, Black Numenorians, and Corsairs joined Sauron's forces to wage a war against the Free Peoples. On June 20th, the Haradrim aided the Witch King to capture Osgiliath, ushering in the War of the Ring. During the subsequent Battle of Pelennor Fields, 6,000 Rohirrim crashed through the Orc forces besieging Minas Tirith. Sensing the desperation of the situation, the great chieftain of the Haradrim mounted a countercharge, meeting Theoden head-on in brutal single combat. The fight dragged on, yet the old king did not falter and struck down his enemy with all the vigour of a man half his age. The Haradrim were further slaughtered as the Rohirrim pushed ever onwards, destroying everything in their path and killing their king, until Theoden looked upon his final foe. The Witch King of Angmar on his fell beast swooped downward, mortally wounding the king under the weight of his beloved steed. Éomer, despite his heartbreak at the loss of his beloved uncle and the perceived loss of his sister, now assumed control of the Rohirrim. The charge, slowed but not stopped, continued to wreak devastation among the forces of Mordor. The men of Gondor began their own sortie from the gates, catching their foes unawares, and also inflicting heavy casualties upon the forces which were closest to the gate. First among them was Imrahil and his mounted Swan Knights, who cut a bloody swath through the forces of the Dark Lord in an attempt to reach Éomer. The fighting grew bloody and desperate, as the immense weight of the Mumakil and Haradrim, alongside the reserves of the Orcs, kept the men of the West separated, allowing the numerical advantage to once more turn the battle in favour of the servants of the Dark Lord, even in the absence of their overall commander. It was at this point that the hearts of every man of the West sunk as the ships of the Corsairs of Umbar arrived. Despite thinking that their defeat and destruction were inevitable, they fought on. Unbeknownst to those fighting upon the Pelennor Fields, Aragorn had launched a daring surprise attack upon the great Corsair fleet as they were raiding Lenin. Together with Legolas, Gimli, the Grey Company, and the Army of the Dead, the future King Elessar of Gondor defeated the Corsairs, destroying many vessels and capturing many more. After seizing the Corsairs' ships, Aragorn and his allies made their way upriver to aid Minas Tirith. Neither side expected Aragorn, alongside the Grey Company and the southern army of Gondor, to emerge from the ships. Yet the impact of this sudden appearance, symbolised by the unfurling of Arwen's banner by Halbarad, was felt by both sides of the conflict. The newly arrived men of the West, with Aragorn at their head, wielding the blade Andúril, drove a wedge through the forces of the Dark Lord, separating those closest to the city from those nearer to the Anduin. None among the servants of Sauron could stand before the might of Andúril that day, as Aragorn swept aside all who stood in his way, cutting deep into the host which threatened his city. Capitalizing upon these unexpected reinforcements, Imrahil and Éomer marshalled their flagging forces time and again through repeated cavalry and infantry charges, cutting off divisions of the Great Horde and slaughtering them en masse. Most of the host of Mordor was slain, with the Orcs now seeing that victory had slipped from their grasp, fleeing and being cut down in the thousands, with many more drowning as they attempted to cross the Anduin to safety. A large force of Easterlings, whose hatred for the men of Gondor outweighed their own instincts for self-preservation, refused to flee the field and fought to the last man, earning the bitter respect of the men of the West. Some of the more disciplined Orcs rallied a rearguard of sorts, and were successful in inflicting heavy casualties upon both the Gondorian and Rohirrim forces, but soon they were overrun too, with Aragorn finishing the last ones off, effectively ending the Orcish resistance and the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. On March 25th, Aragorn led the host of the West to march upon Morannon, in the vain hope of distracting Sauron from the efforts of Frodo and Sam. Aragorn then left a force of just under 1,000 men at the crossroads in order to guard the road to Minas Tirith should the battle go poorly. Midway through Ithilien, they were then assaulted by Haradrim and Easterlings. These soldiers were quickly detected by the Rangers of Ithilien, however, and driven off with little casualties. At the Black Gate, an emissary known as the Mouth of Sauron offered terms of surrender, but Aragorn chose to make battle. Sauron opened the Black Gates, unleashing his forces, outnumbering the host of the West 10-1. The Dark Lord, with his eye fixed firmly upon the battle, urged his subjects forward. His forces crashed into the host of the West like a tide breaking upon the cliffside. The men of the West held, utilizing their superior discipline and martial prowess, as well as the height advantage afforded by the slag piles, to hold back the orcs, trolls, and evil men. As the initial attack of the forces of Sauron failed, armored trolls, wielding crude maces and cudgels, were sent forth. Their attack managed to effectively break down the lines of the men of the West, allowing orcs to swarm through, making Aragorn's position borderline untenable on both slag piles. The orcs further took example of the Easterlings and engaged in flanking maneuvers, attempting to make the most of their encirclement. It was only by the valour and steadfastness of Aragorn's soldiers that the defence of the slag piles could be maintained, despite overwhelming pressure from all sides. Despite the bitter struggle at Morannon, it was only after Frodo and Sam cast the One Ring into the fires of Mount Doom that Sauron's army was destroyed. On the plains of Morannon, the orcs panicked and began to flee, being cut down in droves by the resurgent men of the West. While some of the Easterlings and Haradrim, bearing an undying hatred towards their western counterparts, fought to the last man, being utterly destroyed on that day. Others surrendered and were pardoned by King Ellis. The Haradrim were the very last to stand in defiance of the West, but would make peace with the reunited kingdom at the coronation of King Elessar. Afterwards, the newly crowned kings Aragorn of Gondor and Eomer of Rohan led campaigns to pacify the Easterlings and Southrons. The Mountains of Shadow form the northern border of Harad, extending west to the Bay of Belfalas, with a deserted region contested between her and Gondor. To her northeast lies a border with Khand, and it is unknown how far eastward her lands extend. Harad is subdivided into 3 regions. In the north lies Near Harad, to its western coast lies Umbar, and in the south is Far Harad. Harad contains numerous fortresses, dwellings, and cities along its coasts and interior. The climate of Harad is warmer and sunnier than the climate of Gondor and Rohan, leading to a diverse ecosystem inhabited by animals such as camels, apes, and the enormous oliphants. Even her constellations differ from the rest of Middle-earth. The Haradrim comprise numerous tribes of various ethnicities, organized into several kingdoms. As a collective, they are described as tall and cruel people, grim and not daunted by shade or blade. The men of Near Harad were brown-skinned, with dark eyes and black hair, most likely inspired by Arabs and North Africans. The men of Far Harad were described as black-skinned with white eyes and red tongues, similar to half-trolls, most likely inspired by sub-Saharan Africans. Tolkien based the Haradrim on numerous historic peoples, most notably the ancient Ethiopians. During an interview in 1967, when asked about what lay south of Harad, Tolkien stated, Africa. Thus it is easy to interpret Harad as being akin to northern and northeastern Africa. The Tolkien scholar Tom Shippey theorized that the professor's description of the men of Far Harad was in reference to medieval Europeans' first confused accounts of sub-Saharan Africans. Much of Tolkien's inspiration for the Haradrim came from his essay on Sigilwaraland, which he believed was the Old English word for Ethiopians. The Haradrim's use of oliphants may have been inspired by the Carthaginian army of Hannibal Barca, or that of Pyrrhus of Epirus. At the same time, the emphasis on gold appears to be inspired by the Mughal Empire, which ruled over India in the 17th century. The Corsairs of Umbar were likely inspired by the Barbary pirates of the Ottoman Empire, who raided Italy, Spain, and even the coasts of England. The Haradrim were fond of the colour red. They wore tunics of scarlet, painted their faces scarlet, and flew scarlet banners. Additionally, they adorned themselves with gold ornaments, such as earrings and collars, and even painted their black dreads with gold. Their chieftains bore an emblem with a black serpent over a field of scarlet, and their great beasts bore scarlet and gold trappings. Despite possessing iron during the Second Age, by the Third Age, the Haradrim may have declined in metallurgy, as their main body armor was a corselet of brazen scales, similar to lamellar armor. For further defense, they carried a round spiked shield, painted yellow and black. Their main weapon was a scimitar, and it was said that when the armies drew their swords, they glittered like stars. When Frodo and Sam first saw a dead Haradrim soldier, he was found with a broken sword, possibly indicating it was made out of a weaker metal, such as bronze. The Haradrim spearmen were armed with spears featuring scarlet-tipped blades, possibly similar to the Chinese Chang. Their archers managed to somehow weaponize the tips of their arrows with the Nazgul's Black Breath, a type of poison or evil blight that slipped their victims into a dark and cold sleep, from which they would never recover. Merry, Éowyn and Faramir nearly fell victim to this poison, and were only cured due to Aragorn's use of Athelas. The Haradrim primarily fought as horse-mounted cavalry, but their mightiest weapon of war was the Mumakil. The hides of a Mumak were nearly impossible to penetrate, leading enemy archers to aim for their eyes. The Haradrim rode atop them into battle and strapped towers upon their backs, from which archers and spearmen could launch projectiles. The Mumaks were also used for the transportation of men, supplies, and heavy siege weapons. The Corsairs of Umbar were the naval might of the Southrons, and the only naval force Sauron ever had at his disposal. Their vessels included dromons and ships with deep hulls, rowed by Gondorian slaves chained to the oars. Their sails were black and scarlet, and adorned with a black star or eye. During the War of the Ring, the Corsair fleet consisted of 50 great ships and numerous smaller vessels beyond count. The Haradrim were not a united people, but rather a collective of tribes and kingdoms ruled by chieftains and kings. They had different allegiances, and 3 notable emblems existed among them: the Black Star of the King's Men, the Eye of Sauron, and a mysterious royal standard featuring a black serpent. While perhaps not unified under one banner, the Southrons were unified in their hatred for Gondor. Harad also contained royal lines of the Black Numenorans, as exemplified by Queen Beruthiel, who married King Taranon Felator. Their land forces were led by local Haradrim chieftains, such as the one slain by King Theoden. Below this, as with any general military, most likely existed ranks such as captains, sergeants, and other rank-and-file warriors. In terms of naval power, the captain of the Haven most likely acted as the fleet admiral of the Haradrim, overseeing the numerous Corsair ship captains. The Haradrim fought primarily as mounted warriors. On horseback, they most likely acted as shock cavalry, equipped with the scimitar, shield, and spear, or as mounted archers, armed with arrows laced with the Nazgul's Black Breath. During the Battle of Pelennor Fields, the Haradrim cavalry was outmatched by the numerically inferior cavalry force of Rohan. Despite this, the Haradrim adopted an excellent anti-cavalry tactic. They kept their forces near the Mumakil, whom the Rohirrim horses feared to get close to. Those brave enough to come close were pelted by poisoned arrows from the Mumakil towers. Thus, the Haradrim had adopted a mobile tower formation that could flank the Rohirrim and try to encircle them. Given their use of poison arrows, it seems the Haradrim sought prolonged battles, trying to wear out their opponents. This tactic of attrition was likely devised to compensate for their inferior arms and armor compared to their Gondorian enemies. The Mumakil was an extremely effective war beast, offering considerable flexibility on the battlefield, and serving as a psychological weapon in its own right. These massive creatures acted as mobile fortresses, serving as heavy cavalry units that could trample and overwhelm foot soldiers, as well as acting as siege engines and troop transports. The Mumakil were nearly impervious to projectile weapons, forcing the Rohirrim and Gondorians to aim their arrows at their eyes. In contrast, the Corsairs were opportunistic raiders who seemed only to assail their enemies when they were weak. These skirmishing tactics were rendered ineffective whenever Gondor was capable of fielding a proper fleet, during which times the Corsairs were always defeated. The Corsairs seemed to depend on the element of surprise. Instead of facing the Gondorian navy on equal terms, they seemed to target key leadership among the enemy, notably slaying significant figures such as King Aldemir, King Minadil, and the 15th Prince of Dol Amroth. The Corsairs would have benefited from the knowledge of the Black Numenorians, who lent Numenorian amphibious warfare tactics. Despite all of this, it seems Sauron only augmented his military when needed, as the Corsairs remained a pirate force and never acted as a proper navy. The Haradrim, Corsairs, and Black Numenorians, who collectively made up the Southrons of Tolkien's Middle-earth, share a tragic fate. They were all victims of the tyranny of Numenor and Sauron, manipulated into a war against the West. Fueled by their grievances against Gondor, they unwittingly fought a war that ultimately had little to do with them. During the War of the Ring, the Southrons became a terrifying symbol of the unknown to their enemies. Yet, for all their intimidating status, they were people like any other. Tolkien certainly expected his audience to see the men of the South this way, as exemplified when Samwise Gamgee encounters a dead Haradrim and wondered what the man's name was and where he came from, and if he was really evil of heart, or what lies or threats had led him on the long march from his home, and if he would not really rather have stayed there in peace. More videos on the societies of Middle-earth are on the way, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see them. Please consider liking, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Our videos would be impossible without our kind patrons and YouTube channel members, whose ranks you can join via the links in the description to know our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our Discord, and much more. This is the Wizards and Warriors channel, and we will catch you on the next one.